August 1, 1944, Warsaw, Poland. The summer air hangs thick with anticipation and the scent of impending revolution. In the narrow streets of the city's Wola district, young hands clutch homemade weapons, a mixture of desperation and determination etched on their faces. Among them stands Anna, 19 years old, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes scanning the horizon where the Soviet tanks were rumored to be waiting just across the Vistula River. The distant sound of artillery echoes like thunder, a promise of the coming storm. The city holds its breath. For 5 years, Warsaw has endured the brutal occupation of Nazi Germany, its Jewish population systematically destroyed in the ghetto, its Polish residents subjected to terror, forced labor, and execution. Now, with the Soviet Red Army advancing from the east, having reached the outskirts of the city in late July, the time has come. The Home Army, Armia Krajowa, Poland's underground resistance movement, has spent years preparing for this moment. Operation Tempest, a nationwide uprising against the German occupiers, timed to coincide with the Soviet liberation. In a basement apartment converted into a clandestine radio station, Anna adjusts the frequency dial, her fingers trembling slightly. The code words come through. The hour has come. It's 5:00 p.m. Across the city, similar messages are being received and the uprising begins. The initial clashes catch the Germans off guard as resistance fighters attack strategic points, police stations, military installations, and transportation hubs. The sound of gunfire mixes with the pealing of church bells, a surreal symphony of rebellion and hope. For 3 days, the fighters gain ground, establishing control over significant portions of the city. The mood is euphoric. Victory seems possible, even probable. Yet through the smoke and chaos, the Vistula River remains a constant presence, its waters reflecting the burning city. From the rooftops of Warsaw's tallest buildings, fighters can see the distant silhouettes of Soviet tanks on the eastern bank. They are so close, yet impossibly far. The river has become a symbol of hope, a thin blue line separating occupied Warsaw from the freedom that seems just beyond reach. What the Polish fighters don't know is that this river will soon transform from a symbol of hope into one of betrayal, marking the boundary between salvation and abandonment. As the sun sets on August 4, the reality of their situation begins to dawn on the resistance leaders. The expected Soviet support has not materialized. Instead, the Red Army has halted its advance, watching from across the river as the Germans regroup and bring in reinforcements. The initial euphoria of the uprising gives way to a dawning horror as the residents of Warsaw realize they are facing the Nazi war machine alone, with their supposed allies merely spectators to their impending doom. The Vistula, once a symbol of hope, now mocks them, a physical manifestation of the betrayal that will define their fate. The first week of August 1944 unfolded in Warsaw as a city caught between two opposing realities. On the surface, it was a city in the throes of liberation, its streets echoing with the footsteps of a people reclaiming their dignity. Beneath this veneer of triumph, however, a current of anxiety began to pulse, a quiet dread that grew with each passing hour the expected Soviet reinforcements failed to appear. The initial, explosive joy of the uprising was now tempered by a gnawing uncertainty. The fighters of the Home Army, along with thousands of civilian volunteers, had achieved the impossible. They had seized control of large swathes of their capital, but holding it against the full might of the German Wehrmacht was another matter entirely. In the district of Radmiesy, the city center, a makeshift headquarters had been established in the ruins of a bombed-out department store. Here, General Tadeusz Komorowski, the commander of the Home Army, pored over maps, his face etched with the weight of command. The reports coming in were a mixed bag. In Wola and Ochota, fierce fighting continued, but his forces were making progress. In the Old Town, the heart of historic Warsaw, his soldiers had entrenched themselves, turning ancient cobblestone streets and medieval buildings into a formidable fortress. Yet the most critical piece of intelligence was not what was happening within the city, but what was not happening outside it. The Red Army, which had been positioned just across the Vistula for days, remained motionless. Their radio silence was deafening. For the young fighters like Anna, the disconnect between their reality and their expectations was jarring. She had spent the day carrying messages between different resistance outposts, a dangerous journey that took her through cellars, across rooftops, and through streets littered with debris and the bodies of both friends and foes. The air was a toxic cocktail of cordite, burning wood, and the sickly sweet smell of death. Each time she emerged from the relative safety of a basement, she would instinctively glance towards the river, half expecting to see the Soviet offensive begin, to hear the thunderous roar of their artillery supporting the Polish advance. But there was only silence from the east, a void where salvation should have been. This sense of abandonment was not universal at first. Many clung fiercely to the official narrative, narrative. The Soviets were merely regrouping, preparing for a massive, coordinated assault. To believe otherwise was to entertain a paralyzing despair. Radio broadcasts from London, where the Polish government in exile was based, spoke of the Allies' support and the inevitability of victory. These words, meant to bolster morale, now felt hollow, a cruel taunt in the face of the Soviet inaction. The fighters of Warsaw were beginning to understand a brutal calculus of war. They were not being liberated, they were being sacrificed. The German response, when it came, was swift and terrifying. By August 5th, the initial shock had worn off, and the Nazi high command, enraged by the Polish audacity, ordered a systematic and ruthless counterattack. SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski was given command of the forces tasked with crushing the uprising. He brought with him battle-hardened units, including the notorious SS Sturmbrigade der Luanger, a collection of convicts and criminals known for their unparalleled brutality. The stage was set for a massacre. The assault began in the Wola district, the very area where the Home Army had achieved some of its earliest successes. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense, but an orgy of violence. The der Luanger Brigade, operating with explicit orders to show no mercy, swept through the neighborhood. They massacred civilians in their homes, in hospitals, in the streets they had so recently celebrated in. Men, women, and children were shot, burned alive, or beaten to death. The sounds that reached Anna and her comrades were not just the reports of rifles and the booms of grenades, but the screams of the innocent. The hope that had filled the air just days before was replaced by the metallic tang of blood and the acrid smell of fear. From a vantage point in a partially collapsed tenement building, Anna watched the horror unfold in Wola. Through a pair of binoculars scavenged from a dead German soldier, she could see the black smoke billowing into the sky, the flames consuming entire city blocks. She could see the tiny figures of people running, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. The Vistula River was behind her, a serene, indifferent blue slash across the landscape. She turned and looked at it again, her mind struggling to reconcile the proximity of the Soviet army with the reality of the butchery taking place. They were there. They could see the smoke. They could hear the artillery. Why did they not move? The question was no longer a whisper of doubt. It was a scream of accusation. The river was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a moat separating them from the world, a testament to their isolation. Inside the general's headquarters, the mood was grim. The reports from Wola were confirmed. Tens of thousands of civilians had been murdered in a matter of days. This was not just a military operation. It was an extermination. The German strategy was clear: to terrorize the city into submission by committing atrocities on an unimaginable scale. The Home Army was faced with an impossible choice. They could pull their forces back to defend the core areas, effectively ceding Wola and its remaining population to the Germans, or they could launch a counterattack, sacrificing their already depleted troops in a futile gesture. General Komorowski chose the former, a tactical decision that would haunt him and the Polish nation for decades. It was a retreat born of necessity, but it felt like a betrayal of the very people they were fighting to free. The psychological toll on the fighters was immense. The transition from liberator to survivor, from victor to victim, happened with terrifying speed. The camaraderie that had buoyed their spirits in the first days was now strained by fatigue, hunger, and the gnawing fear of betrayal. The enemy was no longer just the German soldier across the street. It was the silent army across the river. It was the Allied leadership that seemed to have forgotten them. It was the crushing weight of a history that had repeatedly conspired against Polish sovereignty. Anna found herself delivering messages that were increasingly desperate, requests for ammunition that would never come, reports of casualties that grew longer with each passing hour, orders to fall back to new defensive lines. The city was shrinking, the perimeter of Polish control contracting like a dying star. The buildings that had once been symbols of Warsaw's grandeur, the royal castle, the cathedral of St. John, were now just piles of rubble, useful only as cover for the snipers who picked off German soldiers one by one. The beauty of the city was being systematically erased, replaced by a landscape of utter devastation. One evening, as she made her way through the sewers, a dark, stinking labyrinth that had become the primary means of moving undetected through the city, Anna overheard a conversation between two older soldiers. They were not talking about tactics or supplies. They were talking about the Katyn massacre, the 1940 Soviet execution of over 20,000 Polish military officers and intellectuals. For years, the truth had been denied, blamed on the Germans. But these men, veterans of the pre-war Polish army, spoke of it as a known fact, a wound that had never healed. "We should have known," one of them said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We should have known we could never trust them. The river is not a barrier, it is a mirror. It shows us what we refuse to see." The words echoed in the darkness of the sewer, a chilling prophecy of the betrayal to come. By the the middle of August, the initial hope of the Warsaw Uprising had been completely extinguished, replaced by a grim determination to survive. The fighters were no longer fighting for liberation. They were fighting for the right to die on their feet in their own city. The world had turned its back on them, but they had not turned their backs on each other. In the cellars-turned hospitals, doctors performed amputations without anesthesia. In the ruins of kitchens, women made soup from whatever they could find: horsemeat, weeds, wallpaper, paste. The spirit of Warsaw, though battered and broken, refused to be extinguished. And still the Vistula flowed on. Each day the fighters would look to the east, and each day they would see nothing but the impassive Soviet forces. The river had become the central character in their tragedy, a constant reminder of the hope that had been dangled before them and then snatched away. It was a geographical feature, a tactical obstacle, and a profound symbol of their abandonment. The whispers of hope that had filled the air at the start of the uprising had been replaced by the screams of the dying and the silent, accusing flow of the river that separated them from their salvation. The Crucible of Wola. The second week of August 1944 marked a descent into hell for Warsaw. The initial, chaotic euphoria of the uprising had been incinerated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of industrial-scale slaughter. The district of Wola, once a densely populated neighborhood of homes, shops, and factories, was transformed into a charnel house, a vast, open-air theater of Nazi atrocity. The German strategy, orchestrated with chilling precision by SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, was not merely to defeat the Polish resistance, but to erase it, along with the civilian population that supported it, from the face of the earth. This was the Heinz-Reinfarth plan, named after the SS Brigadeführer who would execute it on the ground, a policy of collective terror so absolute it would break the will of the entire city. The killing began on August 5th and did not stop for days. The SS Sturmbrigade Derlwanger, a penal unit composed of poachers, criminals, and ideological fanatics, was the primary instrument of this genocide. They moved through the streets of Wola not as soldiers but as hunters. Their method was systematic. They would block off a street, then go house to house, dragging every inhabitant, men, women, children, the elderly, into the courtyards. There they were systematically executed. Machine guns were set up and lines of people were mowed down. Those who tried to flee were cut down by snipers positioned on rooftops. The sound was a constant, horrifying percussion. The rattle of gunfire, the screams of the victims, the cold, barking orders in German. From her position in the old town, Anna could hear the distant roar of the destruction. The smoke from Wola was a permanent black smear on the horizon, a grim beacon visible from all over the city. The smell was even more invasive, a foul mixture of burning flesh, cordite, and pulverized brick that seeped into every basement and bunker. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical. Every resident of Warsaw knew what was happening in Wola. They knew it could happen to them next. The terror was a weapon, and it was working. The Home Army forces in Wola, hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned, fought with the ferocity of desperation. They were not just defending territory. They were trying to buy time for civilians to escape, to hide, to find a path to the relative safety of the city center. Their weapons were a motley collection of pre-war Polish rifles, submachine guns captured from the Germans, and Molotov cocktails. Against the German tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers, they stood little chance. A single German tank could reduce a barricade built from furniture and cobblestones to splinters in minutes. A flamethrower team could turn a defended building into an inferno, roasting the defenders alive. The tactical disparity was staggering. The German forces were equipped with the latest weaponry of the Third Reich. Their Stu-GIV assault guns, with their low silhouettes and potent 75mm cannons, were nearly invulnerable to the anti-tank weapons available to the Poles, which were often nothing more than captured German Panzerfausts, used at suicidally close range. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies, with Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters and Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers swooping down to strafe and bomb resistance positions with impunity. The Poles had no air cover. Their anti-aircraft guns were few and far between, mostly obsolete relics from the 1939 campaign. For the fighters in Wola, the battle was a series of last stands. A small unit of scouts, led by a young officer named Jan, held a barricade at the intersection of Walska and Kladna streets for 3 days. They were armed with 2 light machine guns, a dozen rifles, and a crate of grenades. They were supported by a handful of civilian volunteers, including a teenage boy who ran messages and a woman who bandaged wounds and brought water from a shattered well. They knew they could not hold the position indefinitely, but their sacrifice allowed hundreds of civilians to flee through the back streets and into the sewers. On the 3rd day, a German Tiger I tank, a 57-ton behemoth of armored steel, turned the corner. Its 88 MKW K-36 cannon fired a single shot. The barricade and everyone behind it ceased to exist. The atrocities committed in Wola were not random acts of violence by undisciplined troops. They were sanctioned from the highest levels of the Nazi command. The goal was to create a volcano of fear that would consume the entire uprising. Hospitals were specifically targeted. The Maria Skłodowska-Curie Institute of Oncology, filled with wounded soldiers and civilians, was stormed by SS units. Patients were dragged from their beds and shot in their beds. Nurses and doctors who tried to intervene were executed on the spot. The wounded were not spared. They were considered enemies of the state. One of the most infamous massacres took place in the Ursus factory at 9 Walska Street. Thousands of civilians, seeking refuge in the large industrial building, were rounded up by the Durluanger Brigade. They were forced to surrender their valuables, then herded into the factory courtyard. The men were separated from the women and children. The men were then shot, their bodies falling into a mass grave that had been dug by the victims themselves. The women and children were forced to watch. Then, they too were murdered. The factory grounds became one of the largest killing fields in the history of the uprising. The exact number of victims in Wola will never be known, but historians estimate that between 20,000 and 50,000 civilians were murdered in the first week of the German counter-offensive. The silence from across the Vistula was a form of complicity. The Red Army, under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, had the military capacity to intervene. They had reached the Praga district on the eastern bank of the river in late July. They had bridging equipment, artillery, and air power. They could have shelled German positions in Wola. They could have launched air raids to disrupt the German supply lines. They could have forced a crossing of the river to relieve the pressure on the Polish defenders. They did none of these things. They watched. Stalin's reasons for this inaction were a complex web of political calculation and ideological malice. He viewed the Polish Home Army with deep suspicion. It was loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, a staunchly anti-communist regime. Stalin's long-term goal was not to liberate a free and independent Poland, but to establish a communist puppet state loyal to Moscow. A successful uprising by the Home Army, one that liberated Warsaw before the Red Army arrived, would be a political disaster. It would create a power base for the London Poles and establish a legacy of anti-Soviet resistance. From Stalin's perspective, it was far better to let the Nazis and the Home Army bleed each other white. The destruction of Warsaw's non-communist resistance was a welcome outcome. This brutal geopolitical chess game was lost on the people dying in the streets of Wola. They did not know of the Tehran Conference, where Stalin had already begun to lay the groundwork for a post-war Eastern Europe under Soviet domination. They did not know of his deep-seated hatred for the Polish state. They only knew that their supposed allies were watching them die. The Vistula River was no longer just a physical barrier. It was a manifestation of Stalin's political will, a liquid wall holding back the forces of liberation, while the forces of annihilation did their work. Every time a Polish fighter looked east, they were not just seeing a river, they were seeing the cold, calculating face of totalitarianism. For Anna, the news from Wola was a personal and ideological breaking point. She had joined the resistance with a simple, patriotic faith: fight the Germans, and when the time came, the Allies would help. Now, that faith lay in ruins, buried under the rubble of Wola. The messages she carried were no longer just tactical reports. They were testimonials of horror. She delivered a note from a priest who had survived the massacre at his church. It described the SS units using flamethrowers on a hospital ward full of children. She carried a list of names from a destroyed outpost, a roster of the dead that included her childhood friend's younger brother. Each piece of paper felt like a fragment of her own soul being torn away. The psychological transformation was complete. The naive young woman who had believed in the righteousness of allies was gone, replaced by a hardened survivor, her heart encased in a shell of fury and grief. The love for her country was still there, but it was now a dark, painful thing, intertwined with a profound sense of betrayal. She fought not for a future of freedom, but for the memory of those who had already been lost. She fought to spit in the eye of the world that had abandoned them. By August 12th, the Wola district was pacified, a Nazi term that meant it was utterly destroyed and its population exterminated. The German forces had achieved their objective. They had broken the back of the Home Army's western defenses and had instilled a paralyzing terror throughout the city. The cost had been the total annihilation of a neighborhood and the murder of tens of thousands of innocent people. The SS units moved on, turning their attention to the neighboring district of Ochota, where the same script of terror and slaughter would be enacted. The Vistula River continued its indifferent flow. On its eastern bank, the Red Army remained in place, a silent, motionless spectator to the tragedy. For the Polish fighters, the river had become the ultimate symbol of their plight. It was a line that separated life from death, hope from from despair, allies from executioners. It was a mirror reflecting the brutal truth of their situation. They were alone, and as the smoke from Wola finally began to clear, revealing a landscape of utter devastation, the people of Warsaw understood that their fight was no longer for their freedom, but for their very existence in a world that had turned its back on them. The crucible of Wola had forged them, but it had also broken them, leaving behind only the hard, unyielding core of resistance. The siege of the old town. With the fall of Wola and Ochota, the German war machine pivoted its full, terrifying weight towards the heart of the uprising, Warsaw's old town. This was not merely a strategic objective, it was a symbolic one. The old town, with its medieval marketplace, its royal castle, its churches and burgher houses, was the historic and spiritual soul of Poland. To crush it was to crush the nation's identity. For the Polish defenders, to hold it was to defend the very idea of Poland, even as the world around them crumbled. The stage was set for a siege that would become one of the most brutal and poignant episodes of the Second World War, a microcosm of the entire uprising's tragedy. The old town was a natural fortress, a dense labyrinth of narrow streets, high-walled buildings, and hidden courtyards. For centuries, its architecture had been designed to repel invaders, and now those same features were turned against the modern war machine of the Wehrmacht. The Home Army fighters, led by a determined corps of officers and scouts, transformed the historic district into a deadly maze. Barricades made of cobblestones, furniture, and debris blocked every major thoroughfare. Windows were bricked up, leaving only narrow slits for rifles and machine guns. Cellars were connected by tunnels gouged through the foundations of ancient buildings, creating a subterranean network for moving troops and supplies unseen. The old town was prepared to become a fortress, and its defenders were prepared to die within its walls. Anna was assigned to a defense post near the Cathedral of St. John, a towering Gothic structure that had witnessed coronations and funerals for Polish kings. Now, its thick stone walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, and its stained glass windows, depicting scenes of saints and martyrs, had been shattered by explosion. Her unit was a mix of seasoned soldiers and young volunteers, their faces grimy with soot and sweat, their eyes hollow from lack of sleep. The atmosphere was a strange mix of terror and transcendence. The air vibrated with the constant thud of German artillery, a percussive rhythm that shook the very ground beneath their feet. Yet, in the quiet moments between bombardments, there was a profound sense of purpose, a feeling that they were part of something larger than themselves, acting as the last guardians of their nation's soul. The German assault on the old town began on August 19th. It was a methodical, grinding operation designed to pulverize the defenses into dust. The primary weapon was not the infantrymen, but the artillery. Massive howitzers like the 210 Mercer 18, positioned on the outskirts of the district, fired shells that weighed over 100 kilograms. When these projectiles hit, they did not just explode, they annihilated. A single shell could collapse an entire building, burying everyone inside under tons of rubble. The sound was apocalyptic, a deep, gut-wrenching roar followed by the terrifying whistle of the incoming shell and the cataclysmic crash of impact. Dust and smoke filled the air, turning day into a perpetual twilight. Following the artillery barrage came the tanks. German Panzer IVs and Stu GIIIs would advance cautiously down the wider streets, their machine guns spraying the windows and rooftops for any sign of resistance. They were met with a hail of fire from the Polish defenders. From upper-story windows, fighters dropped Molotov cocktails and grenades, the glass bottles shattering on the tank's hull, sending sheets of flame washing over the metal. In the narrow streets, the tanks were vulnerable. A well-placed anti-tank round from a captured Panzerfaust, fired from a basement window at point-blank range, could immobilize or destroy a multi-ton vehicle. The fighting was close quarters, brutal, and intensely personal. It was a war of inches, of individual acts of courage and desperation. The defenders of the old town were critically short of two things: water and weapons. The district's water mains had been severed by the shelling, and the only source of water was a single well in the city square, a location exposed to German fire. Every trip to the well was a potential suicide mission. Volunteers, often women and children, would dash across the open square under a hail of bullets, carrying buckets and canteens. Many were cut down, their bodies lying next to the well, a testament to the daily struggle for survival. The shortage of weapons was even more acute. The Home Army had started the uprising with enough supplies for perhaps a week of fighting. Now, 3 weeks in, they were running on fumes. Ammunition had to be rationed with fanatical precision. Every bullet was counted. Every grenade was a precious commodity. The fighters resorted to ingenious and often terrifying methods of warfare. They built electric eels, improvised explosive devices made from artillery shells and telephone wire. They used captured German weapons, scavenging from the battlefield. They fought with knives and and bayonets when the ammunition ran out. The spirit was willing, but the flesh was being worn down by a relentless material disadvantage. And still the Vistula River flowed, a silent witness to the agony. From the highest towers of the old town, the Polish commanders could see the Praga district on the eastern bank. They could see the Soviet encampments, the parked tanks, the antennas of their command posts. They were so close, yet so infinitely far away. The river was a constant, maddening presence, a physical manifestation of their abandonment. Every day, the defenders would scan the horizon, hoping against hope to see the Soviet offensive begin. Every day, they were met with the same soul-crushing silence. The river was no longer just a symbol. It was an active participant in their tragedy, a liquid wall holding back the forces of salvation, while the forces of annihilation closed in. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant shelling, the lack of sleep, the gnawing hunger, and the ever-present smell of death wore down the strongest of wills. The fighters saw their comrades die gruesome deaths every day. They saw the historic buildings they had known their entire lives reduced to rubble. They saw the civilians they were protecting, the very people they were fighting for, wounded and killed in the crossfire. The line between hope and despair was razor thin. One of the most poignant moments of the siege occurred on August 26th. In the cellar of a ruined house, a group of fighters and civilians huddled together as a particularly heavy bombardment shook the city above. Among them was a young boy, no older than 10, who had lost his parents in the first days of the fighting. He was terrified, his small body trembling with each explosion. An old veteran, a man who had fought in the 1939 defense of Poland, put his arm around the boy. "Do not be afraid, little one," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "We are in the heart of Poland. As long as we are here, Poland is not dead." The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with fear and a flicker of understanding. In that moment, in the depths of hell, the old man had passed on the torch of national identity, a legacy that was more important than any military victory. The Germans, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, escalated their tactics. They began using Goliath tracked mines, small remote-controlled vehicles packed with high explosives, to clear barricades and destroy fortified positions. They deployed flamethrower teams to burn the defenders out of their cellars and strongpoints. The air became thick with the smell of burning flesh and incinerated timber. The old town was being systematically burned to the ground. By the end of August, the situation in the old town was becoming untenable. The district was 90% destroyed. The German forces had breached the outer defenses and were fighting their way through the inner streets, house by house, cellar by cellar. The Polish defenders were exhausted, decimated, and almost out of ammunition and water. General Komorowski and his staff faced an agonizing decision: to order a fighting retreat through the city's sewers to the city center, or to stay and fight to the last man. The choice was made for them. On the night of August 31st, the Germans launched a final, massive assault, supported by a terrifying new weapon, the Karl Jarrett mortar, a 600 self-propelled siege howitzer that fired shells weighing over 2 tons. One of these monstrous shells hit the position of the Home Army's headquarters, burying the command structure under tons of rubble. Communication broke down. The organized defense of the old town was collapsing. The order to retreat was given. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to save what was left of the fighting force. The escape route was the city's sewer system, a dark, stinking labyrinth of tunnels that ran beneath the streets. For days, thousands of soldiers and civilians would make their way through this underground hell, wading through waist-deep filth, choking on the toxic fumes, and navigating in total darkness. It was a journey of unimaginable horror, a final exodus from the burning ruins of their historic heartland. Anna was one of the last to leave her post near the cathedral. As she prepared to descend into the manhole, she took one last look at the burning city. The sky was a hellish orange, illuminated by the flames. The royal castle, once a symbol of Polish grandeur, was a gutted shell. The sound of German machine gun fire echoed through the empty streets. The old town was dying, and as she lowered herself into the suffocating darkness of the sewer, she knew that a part of Poland had died with. The Vistula River, flowing just a few hundred meters away, seemed to mock their sacrifice, a silent, eternal reminder of the betrayal that had sealed their fate. The siege of the old town was over, but the agony of Warsaw was far from finished. The agony of Czerniaków and the silence of the guns. The exodus from the old town through the sewers was a journey through a literal and metaphorical underworld. For days, the defenders of Warsaw's historic heart moved in a subterranean river of filth, despair, and fading hope. The air was a thick, poisonous cocktail of methane, sewage, and the damp rot of centuries. It was pitch black, save for the occasional flicker of a candle or a shielded flashlight, guiding the endless, silent column of ghosts. They waded through waist-deep, icy sludge, the walls of the tunnel slick with slime. The wounded were carried on stretchers, their moans of pain muffled by the oppressive darkness. The sound of dripping water water and the shuffling of feet were the only sounds, a grim funeral procession for a fallen city. This was the price of survival, a humiliating and terrifying escape from the inferno above. When Anna finally emerged from a manhole cover in the district of Powell near the riverbank, the world above felt alien. The air, though still thick with smoke, was a shock to her lungs after the toxic atmosphere of the sewers. The light, though dim and hazy, was blinding. She and her comrades were unrecognizable, caked from head to toe in black, greasy muck. They looked like creatures risen from the grave, and in a way they were. The people they had been in the old town, defenders of a sacred place, were gone. They were now refugees in their own city, hunted and broken. The spirit of resistance, though not extinguished, was now a guttering flame, fueled only by a grim determination to not disappear completely. The new center of Polish resistance was concentrated in two main areas: Śródmieście, the city center, and Czerniaków, a district on the southern bank of the Vistula. It was here in Czerniaków that the final cruel act of the Warsaw Uprising's tragedy would be played out, for it was here that the tantalizing, torturous promise of Soviet aid would finally, briefly, flicker to light, only to be extinguished in a final, devastating act of betrayal. By mid-September, the situation in Warsaw was dire. The city was in ruin. The remaining fighters and civilians were starving, exhausted, and critically low on medical supplies and ammunition. The German forces, though having suffered heavy losses, were firmly in control of most of the city. It seemed only a matter of time before the last pockets of resistance would be crushed. Then, on the night of September 13th, something unexpected happened. The silence from across the Vistula was broken. The Red Army finally began to move. Artillery shells from Soviet guns on the eastern bank began to arc over the river, landing on German positions in Czerniaków and Praga. For the first time in over a month, the defenders of Warsaw heard the sound of an Allies' guns firing in their support. A wave of euphoria, fragile and desperate, washed over the exhausted fighters. Was it possible? Had the Soviets finally decided to act? Had the world not forgotten them after all? 2 nights later, on September 16th, the hope became tangible. Under the cover of darkness, small units of the Polish 1st Tadeusz Infantry Division, a unit that was part of the Red Army but composed of Polish citizens, began to cross the Vistula. They came in small, fragile boats, paddling furiously across the dark, swirling water. They were the vanguard of a relief force. On the Czerniaków waterfront, the Polish Home Army fighters watched in disbelief, and then in wild joy as their countrymen in Soviet-style uniforms scrambled ashore, firing their weapons at the German positions. The river, for the first time, seemed to be a bridge, not a barrier. Anna, now positioned in a ruined building overlooking the river, watched the scene unfold through a pair of binoculars. She saw the small boats, the desperate figures leaping onto the muddy bank, the flashes of their rifles in the darkness. A feeling she had not experienced in weeks, something akin to hope, stirred within her. Maybe the nightmare was ending. Maybe they had not been betrayed. Maybe the river would finally deliver them from evil. The landing of the Polish First Army was, however, a gesture, not a genuine rescue operation. Stalin had authorized the crossing for purely cynical political reasons. The uprising had lasted far longer than he had anticipated, and it was becoming an international embarrassment. The Western Allies, particularly Winston Churchill, were putting immense pressure on him to assist the Poles. The landing was a piece of theater, a way for Stalin to demonstrate that he was trying to help, while ensuring the operation was doomed to fail. The forces committed were woefully inadequate. They were sent across without sufficient artillery support, without armored backup, and without a clear, coordinated plan with the Home Army leadership. They were sacrificial lambs, thrown into the meat grinder to placate international opinion. The German reaction to the crossing was swift and brutal. They immediately brought heavy artillery and machine gun fire to bear on the river crossing points, turning the water into a killing zone. They launched fierce counterattacks against the small Polish beachhead in Czerniaków. The men of the First Army, though brave, were cut off and surrounded. They fought with incredible tenacity, but they were trapped. For the Home Army fighters in Czerniaków, the sight of their fellow Poles fighting and dying just across the river was a new form of torture. They could see them, they could hear their battle, but they could not effectively help them. The German forces between the two groups were too strong. Attempts to link up were repelled with heavy losses. The Vistula River, which had briefly seemed like a conduit for salvation, was now a moat separating two groups of doomed countrymen, a stage for a meaningless, tragic drama orchestrated by a dictator in Moscow. The most agonizing aspect of the Czerniaków bridgehead was the sight of the Soviet tanks on the eastern bank. They were there, lined up, their engines idling. They could have easily shelled the German positions blocking the link up, or even crossed the river themselves to support the Polish forces. But they did not move. They remained in place, impotent spectators to the slaughter of their own allies. The symbolism was lost lost on no one. The Soviets were close enough to help, but chose not to. It was a betrayal played out in real time, on a stage visible to all. Anna and her unit were ordered to try and fight their way towards the Cherniakow beachhead. It was a suicide mission. They had to cross open ground swept by German machine gun fire. They moved from ruin to ruin, crawling on their bellies, the bullets snapping over their heads like angry hornets. They saw the bodies of other home army soldiers who had tried the same thing, lying twisted in the rubble. They never got close. After 2 days of brutal fighting, they were forced to retreat, having lost half their men. The dream of linking up with the First Army was dead. The men of the First Army who had crossed the river were left to their fate. They fought for several more days, their ammunition running out, their position becoming untenable. Some managed to escape back across the river under cover of darkness. Others were killed or captured. The last holdouts were finally overrun on September 23rd. The Cherniakow bridgehead, the great hope of mid-September, had become another mass grave. The failure of the Cherniakow operation was the final, crushing blow to the morale of the Warsaw Uprising. It extinguished the last flicker of hope. If the Soviets would not help when their own Polish units were fighting and dying on the western bank, they would never help. The truth was now undeniable, absolute, and soul-destroying. They had been betrayed, not through neglect or incompetence, but through deliberate, calculated malevolence. The uprising was never meant to succeed. It was meant to fail, and the defenders of Warsaw were meant to die. The Vistula River had fulfilled its ultimate symbolic destiny. It was no longer just a barrier or a mirror. It was a tombstone. It marked the grave of Polish hopes, of Allied solidarity, of the very idea that right and justice had any place in the brutal calculus of global politics. The river that had once promised life now delivered only the confirmation of death. With the collapse of the Cherniakow bridgehead, the Germans intensified their efforts to liquidate the remaining pockets of resistance in Eszkutradmiesy. They brought in massive siege mortars and began a systematic bombardment of the city center. The fighting was now a desperate, last stand. The defenders had no illusions of victory. They fought for honor, for the memory of those who had already fallen, and to inflict as much damage on the enemy as possible before the end. Anna, now hollowed out by grief and exhaustion, moved through the ruins of the city center like an automaton. She delivered messages that no longer mattered. She saw the final, desperate acts of resistance. She saw doctors performing surgery without anesthesia on kitchen tables. She saw civilians baking bread from sawdust and flour. She saw the city she loved being systematically erased from the face of the earth. And through it all, she heard the silence of the Soviet guns across the river, a silence that was louder than any artillery barrage. It was the sound of betrayal, the final, agonizing note in the symphony of Warsaw's destruction. By the end of September, the end was near. The city center was 80% destroyed. The remaining fighters were down to their last few rounds of ammunition. General Bor Komorowski knew that further resistance was pointless and would only lead to the pointless slaughter of the remaining civilians and wounded. On October 2nd, 1944, after 63 days of heroic and heartbreaking struggle, he signed the Act of Capitulation. The Warsaw Uprising was over. The terms of the surrender were negotiated with the Germans, who, surprisingly, agreed to treat the home army fighters as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, a status they did not grant to other resistance groups. It was a small, bitter concession. The fighters laid down their arms and marched out of the ruins into captivity. The civilians who remained were to be expelled from the city and sent to labor or transit camps. Anna was one of the thousands who filed out of the smoking ruins of Warsaw. She did not look back. She could not bear to see the final, complete destruction of her home. She walked with her head down, her hands in the air, surrounded by the skeletal remains of buildings and the ghosts of her fallen comrades. The Vistula River flowed beside her, its waters carrying away the ashes of her city, the blood of her people, and the last remnants of her hope. The uprising was over, but the agony of Warsaw would endure for generations. Section Conclusion Epilogue. The river's unchanging course. The guns fell silent on October 2, 1944, but the silence was not one of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard, a vacuum where a vibrant city once stood. Warsaw, the Paris of the East, was no more. In its place was a landscape of utter desolation, a field of rubble stretching to the horizon, smoldering under a gray sky. The Germans, true to their word, methodically began the final destruction, using flamethrowers and explosives to level any structure still standing. Hitler, enraged by the Polish defiance, had ordered Warsaw to be erased from the map. The order was carried out with chilling efficiency. The human cost was staggering. Approximately 18,000 home army soldiers were killed and another 25,000 wounded. But the true horror was visited upon the civilian population. Between 150,000 and 200,000 Polish civilians lost their lives during the 63 days of the uprising, murdered in mass executions like the one in Wola, killed killed in the bombardments or crushed in the collapsing buildings. The remaining 500,000 survivors were expelled from the city, herded into transit camps like the one at Pruskow, and from there sent to forced labor camps across Germany or to concentration camps like Auschwitz. The city was emptied of its people, its culture, its very soul. The Vistula River, the silent witness to it all, continued its unchanging course. It had seen the rise of hope, the descent into hell, the agony of betrayal, and the final crushing defeat. It had been a symbol of every stage of the tragedy, and now it flowed through a dead city, a constant, indifferent reminder of the fragility of human aspiration in the face of geopolitical cynicism. The river's endurance was a bitter counterpoint to the destruction of the city it bordered. The aftermath of the uprising was a complex tapestry of political maneuvering and historical erasure. In the West, the Warsaw Uprising was hailed as a heroic tragedy, a symbol of Polish courage in the face of impossible odds. In the East, under the newly installed communist regime, the story was different. The Home Army was portrayed as criminal, irresponsible adventurers who had launched a hopeless revolt without coordination with the Soviet Union. Their sacrifice was minimized, their leaders were vilified or imprisoned, and their memory was systematically suppressed for decades. The truth of the Soviet betrayal was a forbidden topic, a dangerous counter-narrative to the myth of Soviet liberation. The city itself would rise again. From the ashes, a new Warsaw was rebuilt, its old town meticulously reconstructed using old paintings and drawings as guides. It was an act of defiance, a physical rebirth that mirrored the resilience of the Polish spirit. Yet, the rebuilt city was a ghost of its former self, a beautiful monument standing on a foundation of immense sorrow. The Vistula River flowed past this new city, a link between the past and the present, a silent keeper of memories that were both celebrated and suppressed. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 stands as one of the most profound and tragic lessons of the 20th century. It is a stark testament to the fact that in war, the greatest suffering is often inflicted not by the declared enemy, but by the cynicism of allies who view human lives as mere pawns in a larger game. It is a story about the brutal reality of realpolitik, where the ideals of freedom and self-determination are sacrificed on the altar of strategic ambition. The river that ran through Warsaw serves as an eternal metaphor for this betrayal, a line so easily crossed by hope, yet so impossible to bridge when political will is absent. It asks a question that echoes through history. What is the cost of a nation's soul when its fight for freedom is met not with a helping hand, but with a calculated turning away? The lesson of Warsaw is a warning for all time, a reminder that the line between salvation and abandonment can be as thin and as cruel as a river's current. The end story.